Hello, I'm Dr. Susan LaRusso. I'm the Assistant Director of Curriculum and Instruction and an Assistant Professor at the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Minnesota. The Ellsworth Public Library reached out to me much earlier this year to come to the library and present on this topic, misinformation, what it is, and how to spot it. Unfortunately, like so many other places right now, the library is not holding public events. So instead, I've created this supplemental presentation that will cover different types of problematic information. And I'll be holding a Q&A on August 25th at 10:30. There'll be some information at the end of this presentation where we can talk more about these issues. This presentation is an educational presentation meant to help build media literacy skills by providing definitions of several types of problematic information in the media environment, and to help provide you with some tools to analyze and evaluate information. Much of my own research is about media misinformation, and I teach a semester-long class to our majors on media literacy. In this presentation, I will give you definitions and examples of problematic types of information, including fake news, disinformation, and misinformation. Then, I will give you tips and tools to spot and evaluate different types of problematic information. And at the end, I have a special note on COVID-19 misinformation. The first three types of problematic information that I'm going to present are probably all words that you've heard frequently. They're kind of buzzwords. So here I have fake news. We'll also discuss disinformation and misinformation. All three definitions that I'm presenting are pulled from dictionary.com. If you went online and looked up the definition from various dictionary websites, you would find similar definitions. These are also very close or represent the spirit of the definitions we use in academia and education. So fake news, this phrase gets thrown around quite a bit. Fake news has existed throughout time. This definition here has been accepted and used for quite some time. We hear it in public discourse, often used in a different way. But here, the definition, false news stories, often of a sensational nature, created to be widely shared online for the purposes of generating ad revenue via web traffic or discrediting a public figure, political movement, company, etc. This definition is important. There are really kind of two aspects here of how you might evaluate something as fake news. So certainly the story, the information is false, generally pretty sensationalistic, but it is knowingly created to be false. So whoever has created the information knows that it's false. And there's really one of two motivations. Perhaps those motivations go hand in hand, but the information, the false information, is created to either make some money online to get people to click, okay, to spend time on your website, to generate ad revenue, or to discredit. So, and that usually is politically motivated to discredit a public figure, a movement, or you might want to discredit a company. So those are really the two important aspects if we want to label something as fake news. Okay? Did the individual, the organization that created the information, know that it was false? And then what were their motivations? Was it to make money or to discredit? If those can be answered yes, then we are looking at fake news. Here I have a couple examples of fake news stories that circulated widely on Facebook where a lot of fake news lives. First is this story. Trump's grandfather was a pimp and tax evader, his father a member of the KKK. This was the number one viewed, clicked on fake news story of 2019. It had an estimated of 29 million views. There's no evidence to support either aspects of this story. You can see here that it was circulated by Impeach Trump, an organization that explains itself as being dedicated to impeaching Trump and saving American democracy. They're a project of Occupy Democrats. Occupy Democrats, a lot of the information that they produce, that they circulate, is questionable at best. Okay, I would not consider them to be a reliable source. Okay, so this information, it's really fake news. It fits both of those definitions, both of those aspects of the definition of fake news, that it is false information, and they're really trying to discredit a public figure. Now, the second one, this was the 10th most popular, most circulated, most clicked on fake news story of 2019. Joe Biden calls Trump supporters dregs of society, and this was on lifenews.com. Here they have, if you click on it, actually, if you go to the story and watch the clip, it says that Joe Biden calls Trump supporters dregs of society. But if you actually listen to it, he's giving a speech at a human rights campaign dinner. And he does say that he does talk about dregs of society, but it's in the context of those who attack the LGBT community. And he says there's a small percentage of the American people, virulent people, some of them the dregs of society. Nowhere in there does he mention Trump supporters, and instead is focusing on those who attack the LGBTQ community. Okay, so here again, we have a questionable source, lifenews.com. They have a particular agenda. This information is false. All you have to do is listen to his speech to know that he did not say that. And their focus is really to discredit Biden and often Democrats in general. So again, fitting that definition of fake news. The second type of problematic information we'll discuss and look at is disinformation. So disinformation is false information which is intended to mislead, especially propaganda issued by a government organization to rival power or the media. So this definition doesn't differ wildly from fake news, but the key element here is that generally disinformation comes from a foreign government, okay, to a rival power. But again, who creates the information? They know that it is false information, and there's a particular motive there. So really trying to mislead, discredit, etc. So in focusing on disinformation, what we can now talk about is the Russian disinformation campaign on social media during the 2016 election cycle. This will now become, or has become, the classic example of disinformation. So many social media sites, US intelligence agencies, and others found and have confirmed that there was an ongoing campaign from Russia to spread disinformation via social media. And that campaign goes on today. There are more roadblocks now that has been identified than in 2016. But during that election cycle, Facebook found that there were over 3,000 ads linked to the Russian government on Facebook that contained inaccurate information, and that reached at least 126 million users. A lot of these ads, a lot of the information really focused on divisive political issues instead of really individual candidates. I'll show you a couple examples here in a moment. And oftentimes the ads just tried to drive people to Facebook landing pages that are free, of course. So this disinformation campaign did not cost the Russian government very much. Facebook was inundated with disinformation, but it was also found on YouTube and Twitter and other social media platforms. Here I have a few examples of confirmed disinformation spread on social media during the 2016 election cycle. The first two were found on Facebook. Facebook has confirmed that both of these, quote unquote, organizations, Army of Jesus and Heart of Texas, are tied to Russia. Now, both of these do focus on Clinton, discrediting her. The first one, of course, calls Clinton Satan. The second one, from Heart of Texas, focuses on the dislike of Clinton by U.S. veterans, and discusses, Benghazi really in that kind of conspiratorial way, conspiracy theory way. The next two were found on Twitter, and these both discuss how you should vote, and voting by text or by tweet. The problem there, hopefully, you'll recognize, is that you cannot vote by text or by Twitter. And so there we have, this is incorrect, false information, really trying to suppress the vote, right? Giving people information that is incorrect about how they might vote. Okay, so again, a couple examples of disinformation, all with Russian ties, spread on social media during the 2016 election cycle. The problematic information we'll discuss is misinformation. Misinformation was a 2018 word of the year from dictionary.com. Their definition is false information that is spread regardless of whether there is intent to mislead. So information that we might identify as misinformation could fit either of the previous definitions discussed, so fake news or disinformation, but it is broader. So here the real key is that this is false information, but there may not be intent to mislead. Okay, so I'll give you some examples of kind of this broader definition of what misinformation is. So misinformation often, it's inaccurate, it's misleading, it's oversimplified, and that's where we can sort of identify there may not necessarily be this intent to mislead, but regardless, it really is false information. Here I have a couple examples of misinformation. So the first is a correction issued by the AP talking about a tweet they had previously disseminated that they've deleted now because the tweet talked about a giraffe being born, but the photo included was not the giraffe that had been born. A new tweet is upcoming. Okay, so something somewhat minor, but they presented an incorrect photo, okay, that could be misleading to the viewer, to the reader. Okay, this would be an example of misinformation. It's false information that is spread, but there wasn't necessarily intent to mislead, okay, but false information regardless. Another example is this: 1 in 8 women will be diagnosed with breast cancer in their lifetime. Okay, so this would imply if there are 8 women in a room, one of those women will likely be diagnosed with breast cancer in their lifetime. Okay, this is an example of really an oversimplified statistic. The fact is, this becomes true 1 in 8 women for women that live to be in their late 70s. So, the kind of uncouth way of saying this was if something else doesn't get you first, this statistic becomes true. But in reality, age really matters. And so women in their 30s, they have a chance of 1 in 227 of being diagnosed with breast cancer. Women in their 40s, 1 in 68, and even women in their 60s, 1 in 28. Okay, so this statistic, unlikely that there was real intent to mislead, but doesn't represent reality for the different stages in a woman's life. Okay? Instead, is really that lifetime statistic if you live to be into your late 70s. Okay, so another example of misinformation. So far, we've discussed definitions of problematic information and looked at some examples. Here are some specific tips on how you can evaluate information you are viewing, you are reading. Headlines. Headlines shouldn't provoke strong emotions. If a headline is phrased in a way that does provoke strong emotions, you should question that story, or at least the way it is being presented to you. Always try to understand who is giving you the information. Check the About Us section. Who wrote this information? What perspective might they have? What background do they have? Who do they work for? What is their training? Okay, this will help you to understand if there is a particular bias or what that particular bias might be. It'll help you to understand why they are disseminating the information that they are. Most news sources, for example, are going to embed links in the article to their sources. If there are links, make sure you click on those. Try to find the original source of information. Is the way that it's being reported in line with the way the original source presented the information? Are other sources or other organizations covering the story? In today's media environment, a story does not exist in isolation for very long. Okay, even if one news organization has a breaking story, within 10 to 15 minutes, many other news organizations will be presenting that information as well. Okay, so if you do a Google search, for example, and you can't find any other source reporting on that information, you should definitely question the validity of the information you're being presented with. Check the date. Okay, sometimes, especially on social media, stories will recycle themselves. And so in the original context, if this was 1-2 years earlier, it might make much more sense. Taken out of the time context, it could seem more concerning than it actually is. So make sure you understand when that piece of information was published. In general, read as many sources as possible, okay? Or if you're watching news on TV, try to watch news on various channels. Okay, that way you can understand a story more fully if you're getting it from multiple sources. Use fact-checking websites. There are many out there. I'll show you a few. These can really help you to understand the validity, the credibility of a given story. So I have a few examples here of, at least, at minimum, misinformation spread on social media. So about a year ago, this story popped up that Joe Perry from Aerosmith died. So how might we verify this information? Well, just looking at the source here, the Weekly Observer, we might understand, so this is a tabloid publication. They often publish kind of sensationalistic information. So that should make us question the information at least. Okay. Remember that idea, is anybody else reporting this story? So when I saw this on Facebook, I Googled it and found that nobody else was reporting it. Seemed like it would be a pretty big story. Another key here, when we're confronted with information on social media, it is really important to read beyond the headline. Click on the story. So if you click on the story, guess what? It just says that he was hospitalized. It does not say that he had died. Okay? But when we see this, that he had died, makes you want to click. Okay, that generates ad revenue for the Weekly Observer. So this is false. Joe Perry is not dead. Here's another story that was shared on social media. This is actually one of the top fake news stories of 2018, stating that Michael Jordan resigned from Nike's board and took his Air Jordans with him. He was apparently upset about Nike's support of Colin Kaepernick. Okay, so what might we do to verify this story? Well, first of all, I mentioned you want to check that About Us section. When we do that, we see that this is from Trump Betrayed Us, and it's a subsidiary of America's Last Line of Defense network of parody, satire, and tomfoolery, or Snopes calls it junk news, because they're too stupid to understand what satire means. So this is a satirical site, and the information is not meant to be accurate. Okay? They are, poking fun of institutions, of individuals. Okay, so that should, clue us in. Another thing, so there are embedded links in this story. They quote someone and then they link the individual. If we click on the link, which generally in a traditional news story we would find maybe another news story about that individual, or some kind of landing page giving us information about the individual quoted. Here, when I click on the link, I get this GIF of a guy trying to dunk a basketball. Okay, that should clue us into that they are not, giving us an actual quote from an individual. Okay, another way we could try to confirm or deny this story is a simple Google search. Nobody else is reporting on this story because it's not true. We might also be curious about Michael Jordan being on Nike's board. Guess what? Never on Nike's board. Okay? This story is completely fabricated. So those are a few ways that we can, investigate the truthfulness, the authenticity of this story. I mentioned previously that make use of fact-checking websites. These are three: Snopes, FactCheck.org, and PolitiFact that I would recommend the most. These are independent fact checkers. They're not tied to news organizations. They are, nonpartisan. Snopes is more of an investigative journalism site. FactCheck.org comes from Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. And PolitiFact comes from Poynter, which is a nonprofit media studies organization. So they have kind of different groups of people that do fact checking, and they have different methods of fact checking, but they are dedicated to fact checking, unlike news organizations that are trying to do multiple things. So these can be really good resources to check to see if they have investigated and written on information you might be seeing, specifically kind of online social media information. Before we conclude this presentation, I wanted to acknowledge the biggest story of 2020, COVID-19, and point out that there is a plethora of misinformation around the disease in the current media environment. While I previously discussed tools, tips to evaluate information about a complex and new disease, uh, even more tools are required, more skills. Here are some tips about how to evaluate information about epidemics, pandemics from the Poynter Institute. When we have the Q&A on the 25th, I would like to talk more about how to evaluate information related to COVID-19 and talk about kind of the process, the scientific process to how we gain knowledge about a disease, how to treat it, how to cure it potentially. So just wanted to put this on your radar. And if you join us for the Q&A session on the 25th, we'll talk more about this. That's it for now. I'd like to thank you so much for watching, and I'd like to thank the Ellsworth Public Library for inviting me to speak on media literacy and misinformation. If you have any questions or you'd like to hear more, I invite you to join us for our virtual Q&A session on Tuesday, August 25th at 10:30 a.m. There, I'm happy to take any questions you might have. I'd like to talk more about COVID-19 misinformation and also news versus opinion. To register and for more information, go to ellsworthlibrary.org. In the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at my email address. Thanks again, and I hope to see you and talk with you soon.